This presentation is a review of differential reinforcement. This may be somewhat of a review for you, but I think it's good to look at everything now in the context of some of the material we just covered. This will relate back to teaching alternative behaviors and the efficiency analysis that we just completed. Essentially, differential reinforcement is when we apply reinforcement differentially. In other words, we reinforce one behavior in the presence of some kind of stimuli, and we do not reinforce it in the presence of some other stimulus. This is how we establish stimulus control, and this is how the environment signals someone that a particular behavior will be reinforced. When we use reinforcement programs to change behavior, we're taking advantage of this learning process that occurs within all of us. With schedules of reinforcement, there's some basic concepts I want to review really quickly. We know that the fastest way to teach a new behavior is to reinforce it every time it occurs. This is called continuous reinforcement, and it's when the ratio of a response or behavior to delivery of reinforcement is 1-to-1. This will result in learning faster than any other kind of arrangement. And it's also why we do the efficiency analysis to ensure that these new behaviors that we're teaching get reinforced right away. We have to establish them first. So the advantage of continuous reinforcement, you get very fast acquisition. However, the disadvantage is that when reinforcement stops suddenly, you get an almost immediate decrease in responding. Maybe you get a little increase right away, that's called an extinction burst, but you get extinction very quickly with a behavior that's been reinforced continuously. This is what a lot of people who speak out against using reinforcement schedules with children point out, that if you quickly remove it, it will show a decrease in behavior. Those folks don't understand how to effectively use reinforcement, though, because the next step in a reinforcement plan, once you establish a behavior, you switch to intermittent schedules of reinforcement. Intermittent reinforcement is when we reinforce not every occurrence, but we reinforce the behavior based on some kind of schedule. This strengthens the behavior. It makes it more resistant to extinction. In other words, the behavior will occur longer without being reinforced, either naturally or through some kind of reinforcement program. And it's the way that we build a bridge between some kind of programmed reinforcement and the behavior being maintained by naturally occurring reinforcement. Our goal when we teach a new behavior is to have that behavior being maintained by naturally occurring reinforcement. In other words, if we teach a communication skill, we want the student's use of communication to maintain that behavior. For a lot of children, that will not happen without some additional kind of reinforcement to begin with. So we begin by continuous reinforcement, and then we fade or thin the schedule of reinforcement using some kind of intermittent schedule. There are different types of intermittent schedules. We can divide them into two basic types. Ratio schedules have to do with reinforcing a number of behaviors, like reinforcing a student for doing every 5 math problems, he gets a point. Interval schedules have to do with reinforcing a behavior after a certain period of time has occurred. So if we are reinforcing a student for reading every 3 minutes, that's an interval schedule. It's based on time. Ratio schedules can be either fixed or variable. So with a fixed ratio schedule, we reinforce an instance of behavior that's occurred, say, after the person, well, after the 5th instance, in other words, would be a fixed ratio 5 or FI5. A lot of problem behavior is actually maintained by ratio schedules of reinforcement. People don't think of it that way, but consider this. when you were doing some of your observations, you noticed that, let's say if a kid is doing a behavior to get attention, that kid does not get attention every time that behavior occurs. Sometimes it's ignored, and in fact, maybe it's ignored most of the time. But what if about every fifth time the kid gets attention? That's a ratio schedule of reinforcement. This is also why we should not be surprised if extinction or just ignoring a behavior is not enough to reduce that behavior substantially. It's because these kids have been reinforced on intermittent schedules and usually ratio schedules for long periods of time, and resistance to extinction is very strong. So schedules of reinforcement, like other kinds of reinforcement, it's not something that's always planned, and it's not something that's always associated with appropriate behavior. It's a principle of learning that works both ways. Interval schedules, technically, reinforce the first response that occurs after a certain period of time. So if I'm reinforcing a student for being on task, let's say, and I'm using an interval schedule of reinforcement, I may reinforce the student for being on task the first time he engages in some kind of on-task response after 3 minutes has occurred. Both ratio and interval schedules can be fixed or they can be variable. With a fixed schedule, the value of the schedule is the same from one delivery of reinforcement to the next. So with a fixed ratio or FR schedule, if I'm reinforcing the fourth response, I reinforce every fourth response. With a fixed interval schedule, if it's a fixed interval value of 2 minutes, I'm reinforcing the first response after every 2 minutes has occurred. Fixed schedules have a limitation in that both fixed ratio and fixed interval schedules produce a certain pattern of responding. They're a little bit different, but they're similar. Usually you will get an increase in the rate of responding just before the reinforcer is delivered. After the reinforcer is delivered, you get something called a post-reinforcement pause. This is something that all of us have experienced. Have you ever experienced, well, let's say studying for a test? The closer you get to the date of the test, your rate of studying increases. You get, more and more studying right up until when you take the test. As soon as you take the test, you probably will not study for a day or two. It's the same, that's a pattern of behavior that's produced by a fixed ratio schedule of reinforcement. Fixed interval schedules of reinforcement produce the same or similar. They're a little different again because fixed intervals based on time, so you get more of a scalloped effect. In other words, if you graph the rate of the student's behavior, you'll see that graph rising and getting higher and higher just before that interval. And at the end of the interval, there's delivery of reinforcement and the behavior drops off. And then as time passes, it builds up again. So you get scalloped performance is what it's called usually, but the term post-reinforcement pause is a pause in responding after a reinforcer. I saw this working with children years ago. One young man with whom I was working had a reinforcement plan. He got daily reinforcers, and eventually we built in a weekly reinforcer, and at the end of a week, if he had earned a certain percentage of points, he got to go to the store and rent a video game. And that was a big deal for him. He would get to rent any video game that he chose. Well, the ones that were appropriate, obviously. We put some off limits because the material was not appropriate for him. But his behavior, what we noticed, this was in effect a fixed interval schedule of reinforcement because he got reinforced at the end of this week-long period. He would go to the video store, and I would take him often. We'd come back, and he would get his game, and he'd put it away, and he knew he could play it later. And he would immediately go into the classroom and just have a meltdown. He would have this awful time. And we were really puzzled by this until we just thought back to our very basic behavior management. And we said, you know, this is a post-reinforcement pause. He has experienced a reinforcer. Immediately after he earned the reinforcer was the longest time before the next reinforcer. So this was the pattern of behavior we were seeing. And I'll tell you a little later what we did to help with this. But you'll see this with students with behavior programs, and we'll learn some ways to work around that. This is just with the fixed ratio, you see the highest rate of response or higher rate of response, the higher the value of the schedule. In other words, if you require a lot more of something, usually you see faster work. So if a kid has to do more math problems in a certain period of time, you're going to see the kid working faster if he or she's trying to earn the reinforcer. And you have to be careful about this because that could be a situation that could decrease the student's accuracy. In other words, if you just focus on speed and reinforcing a large number of something, you may see accuracy go down. So sometimes we have to balance this out to what's a reasonable number and how much time do you really want the student to spend on the task. Okay, just a moment ago I mentioned problems with a post-reinforcement pause. The way around that is to use variable schedules rather than fixed schedules. Both ratio and interval schedules can be varied. So with a variable schedule, the value of the schedule changes from one delivery of reinforcement to the next, and it usually changes around some kind of average. So with a variable ratio schedule, it would be the average of every fourth behavior that occurred. So it might be 3 one time, might be 6 the next time, then it might be 2, then it might be 7, then it might be 5 and 3 and so forth. And then sometimes it is actually 4. With a variable interval schedule, it's the first response that occurs after an average of whatever the value of the schedule is. So it might be on average of every 2 minutes, could be 1 minute, could be 4 minutes, could be 2 minutes. The student I mentioned before that had the weekly reinforcer, we actually went to a variable schedule with him. And we actually made it a secret variable schedule. So he did not know whether he was going to go 5 days, 3 days, or 6 days. And we didn't tell him. And his behavior on the day that he was to earn the reinforcer would determine whether he would earn the video game. We immediately saw that post-reinforcement pause disappear, and his behavior stayed consistently at an improved rate. Now, we didn't start him out with a variable schedule because you see faster learning if you reinforce more frequently. So part of the thinning of schedule of reinforcement was to move from a fixed schedule to a variable schedule. So with a variable ratio schedule of reinforcement, you see more consistency in the students responding. You see more maintenance of a certain rate of behavior, and you do not see a post-reinforcement pause. So if you, for instance, were interested in increasing a student's fluency of doing some kind of work, you would want to move from a fixed ratio schedule to a variable ratio schedule so that you would get a steadier rate of work from the student. Okay, now that we've reviewed basic schedules of reinforcement, let's talk about the concept of differential reinforcement. Differential reinforcement is the process or mechanism by which stimulus control is established. In other words, it's the way that we learn how to behave differently according to the signals that are present in our environment. We learn that in one type of setting, one type of behavior will be reinforced. In a different kind of setting or location or with different people, different behaviors will be reinforced. When we're working with a student with problem behavior, we're trying to take advantage of this naturally occurring learning process, and we're trying to establish the signals or cues present in the school setting or home setting as signals for appropriate behavior rather than the challenging behavior. So the way we do that is we want to establish these signals or cues, or antecedents is the word we've been using, and we want to reinforce the behavior that we want to see in the presence of those signals, or we want to reinforce lower rates of some kind of problem behavior. We'll talk about that later. That's called a DRL. At the same time, we're withholding reinforcement or minimizing reinforcement for the challenging behavior. This is the basic concept behind all the differential reinforcement programs. Here's a simple diagram just to illustrate what we're talking about with differential reinforcement. I'm going to introduce a new term here. This term is EO, or establishing operation. This is the same thing as a setting event. It's just another term that I actually prefer. We'll learn that there are establishing operations. These are things that make something more reinforcing, and that there's also something called abolishing operations that make things less reinforcing. But for right now, let's just consider an EO, or establishing operation, as a setting event. In this situation, the setting event is the fact that this child has been deprived of one-on-one attention for some period of time. So this may be a situation with some of the students you've been observing, that you see more behavior problems after the student has gone a period of time without some kind of one-on-one attention. The behavior that we're reinforcing is the student playing with toys, and playing with toys in the presence of the adult being busy with something else. The reinforcer that we're using is praise, or specific praise, like, I really like the way you're playing with the toys. The problem behavior was tantruming. So what we had before is the child would have tantrums in situations where he had been left alone for a period of time. He was required to entertain himself. He'd have tantrums, and that would lead to attention from the adult. So under the differential reinforcement paradigm, playing with toys in the presence of these situations leads to praise. Having a tantrum, praise is withheld. So toy playing is being differentially reinforced. If praise is an effective reinforcer for this child, we would expect to see more toy playing in the presence of this discriminative stimulus and less tantrums over a period of time.